Hey everybody, and welcome to the webinar. This is the Western Landowners Alliance webinar on fire and drought. Today we'll be talking to you about facing fire and drought in a changing West and managing federal lands. My name is Jessica Crowder. I'm a policy associate for the Western Landowners Alliance. I'm based in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And I'd like to take just a moment to share a little bit with you about the Western Landowners Alliance and the aim of this panel today before we jump in. So, again, the webinar is Facing Fire and Drought in a Changing West and Managing Federal Lands. Well, the Western Landowners Alliance is particularly interested in this topic, as our members and our constituents and our supporters, because we're interested in thinking about and designing policies and programs that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. We're a landowner-founded and a landowner-led organization headquartered in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but with staff and supporters across the West and really across the U.S. I'd like to take just a moment to thank a few people who really helped pull this webinar together. Louis Wirtz provided tech support and advertising. If you have any questions about tech, Louis is here to help out. Just put your questions in the chat. And also Hallie and Alex, more colleagues from the Western Landowners Alliance, who will be monitoring the chat for comments and questions during our discussion. So as we discuss fire and drought management with our panelists, you can place your questions and your comments in the chat, but we prefer that you use the question and answer box as you can. We will have time at the end of the panel discussion for audience questions. So we all know that the West has faced some changes over the past several years and the past several decades, really. We've seen increased drought, more extreme drought, changes in precipitation patterns, and more catastrophic wildfires in the West, and longer fire seasons in the West. With these changes, land managers and land stewards, whether it's private, state, or federal lands, face different challenges. And so the idea behind this panel and the panel discussion is to learn from those land managers who are facing these challenges in real time, including federal land managers, as they consider drought management, post-fire recovery, and building resilient and resistant communities and operations. And we'll also be spending some time discussing the importance of partnerships and relationships in these conversations. I'd like to take just a moment to introduce our panelists. Brenda Richards is the coordinator of the Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership, and she's also a rancher in Owyhee County. Brenda has vast experience in rangeland policy, and she has served as an elected official. She has experience in collaborative partnerships across the West and in Idaho. Dwayne Richards is the U.S. Forest Service Region 2, which is the Rocky Mountain Region Range Program Manager. Dwayne has a BS in Animal Science from Oklahoma State University. He's worked across the U.S. from midgrass, shortgrass, tallgrass prairies. He's worked in the Gulf Coast marshes, the Appalachian Mountains, and now he's in the Rocky Mountains. He's used to working in systems that see drought and fire and has some well thought out ideas around how to manage around these challenges. Justin Howe is the president of the Gates Family Ranches, a large guest and cattle operation that includes the A-Bar A Guest Ranch and Big Creek State Line cattle ranches in Wyoming and Colorado. Justin leads strategy and sustainability efforts across the organization and has an MBA from the University of Wyoming. And then John Ruhs, who is the Bureau of Land Management's Idaho State Director, a position he started in March of 2019. Before his current assignment, John worked as the BLM Assistant Director of Fire and Aviation at the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho. He served as a Nevada State BLM director from 2015 to 2018 and has had various jobs across the BLM during his career. He has extensive experience in public land management, including in the fire sector. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and jump into questions with our panelists. Again, as we go through this, if you need help with tech, please do let us know. Add your questions into the chat. We do have a question and answer box. You can see that tab at the bottom of the webinar. Make sure that you use the question and answer tab to get your questions in, and we'll try to address as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar or towards the end of the webinar. And then also everybody that's in the audience is on mute and your video is off. So again, make sure that you're using the chat and the Q&A functions if you need to get through to either me as the moderator or the others who are assisting with this webinar. Now that we have the housekeeping taken care of, let's jump into the real good stuff of this conversation. I'm going to start with the question for our panelists, and Brenda, I'd like you to kick us off here. Can you tell us about your most memorable experience related to managing lands through fire, and that can be prescribed fire or unplanned wildfire and drought, good, bad, or otherwise? What is your most memorable experience?
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to share this on the panel and some of the thoughts. I would be remiss in anybody who has heard about the soda fire if I can't say that that is my most memorable experience about a fire. I would certainly not be racking my brain hard enough. So there's a couple of things that were really, in reflecting on this question, that were memorable about it. Number one, we get lightning storms in our high desert area in the summertime, you know, and the combination of perfect conditions, we're always aware of that. Have been, you know, most of my lifetime. So, you know, when it actually hits, one of the most memorable things or I guess the most striking things, I would say, is how quickly everything happens. Not just the fire moves so rapidly, and we lost over, not we, but in our area, it was almost 300,000 acres over a very short amount of time because of the dry conditions, the wind, everything. It was, for lack of a better term, a perfect storm. Not only does the fire happen fast, but we moved our cattle 6 different times in 3 days to try to stay. I always say it was like a little old lady trying to go back and get her purse from the last place she left it, because we'd go move the cattle and then the fire would come back the other direction. And so that was something that was really striking. And then it also moves fast after things settle down with the fire aspect. You have to be ready to find a place to go with cattle. You have to be ready to understand your ranch well enough to know what that situation is right at that moment, whether you're in the middle of haying and you're going to have to change and use some feed, you know, for your cattle. And you also need to be aware and of those relationships that you've already established. It's very important to have a good relationship with your for us, it's the Bureau of Land Management, with your local people, with the people that you're going to need to be reaching out to. You need to know the neighbors. You need to know who the permittees are involved, because post-fire, for the agencies and for the ranchers and for the community, moves very quickly too. And one of the things I was very grateful for is we had established in our community, we've had a number of local collaborations, everything from the cattle associations to the historical society, to our local sage grouse working group, which involves, members from the Treasure Valley area, from the Boise area that are members of our work group, to the Nature Conservancy, to agencies. These were all key in moving some of the things forward that we needed. And the relationships that were built with our local field office, our local range people, enabled us to pull together a meeting within a week with the permittees and work with knowing our neighbors, being able to get that information on how much fence was lost, what range improvements were gone, what do you have available on your private ground. And then we also pooled some information on, I know while the fire was burning, I was on the phone with connections that I had made, making a list of places where pasture might be available out of the state, in the state, and sharing that not only with our neighbors, but also with the BLM, so that when they got questions in the local field office, there was some possibilities there. So there's a number of those things that I think are very memorable, because we spend a lot of times in meetings, we spend a lot of times talking about collaborative efforts and partnerships. But when the rubber meets the road on something like that, that's when those pay dividends that you can't even imagine. And that's where I would like to just put in there too, that it's not always, it's kind of like any relationship that's worthwhile. Everything's not always going to be, sunshine and roses when you're establishing those relationships. But that's what builds the strength, and that's what builds the ability to pull together and move on these things. Again, whether it's your local sage grouse working group, or just people that come to our local county fair or our cattlemen's meetings, or from the Treasure Valley, we had a lot of help, and then with the agencies too, and that helped us. The partnerships that we have been able to work on in Idaho with collaboration between agencies, NRCS, BLM, Forest Service. We don't have Forest Service in Owyhee County, no Forest Service permits, but the relationships that we had with Fish and Wildlife that came from local working groups, with the Office of Species Conservation, with the BLM, those all came together and helped with restoration and things like finding cedars, finding seed, finding places for people to go with pasture. So my most memorable experience is the ability that we had to move quickly. There's a lot of things that happen during a fire that you remember, some of them pretty tragic or not so cool, but the most memorable thing is what can come out of it, the positive that can come out of it if you establish those things ahead of time.
Thank you, Brenda. John, I'm going to turn it over to you. Can you tell us about your most memorable experience related to either fire or drought?
Well, I'm going to try it, Jessica. There are so many experiences that I could talk about, and I think I'm going to kind of couch it in a way that, for me, one of the most exciting things that I've been able to be part of is prescribed fire. I've been involved with quite a few RX projects. I think what makes those unique or very interesting to me is the fact that I've been engaged in the planning process, and then in the implementation of the actual burning. I've been an ignition specialist, I've been a firing boss, I've been on a holding crew, I've been the burn boss. So I've had a lot of positions on the actual prescribed fires, and so I could spend a lot of time talking about some of the good, the bad, and the ugly that I've seen when it comes to prescribed fire. But I think some of the important things are after that. And I've had lots of opportunities to go back to these project sites and to see the benefits, the successes that we've had with prescribed fire. But I say that with the knowledge as well that you have to have some upfront understanding of what the resource is. And so you just can't, light a fire and think that you're going to help things. You have to know what that resource is. You have to know what the conditions are. You have to know what what the climate patterns are. You have to know what, you know, what soil types. All those things have to be part of that planning process before you ever push the button and start the implementation. So again, I can talk for a long time about, you know, the fun things that I've done on prescribed fire, but I think really what it comes down to is making sure that you do the upfront planning, you know the resource, you know you have all your partners on board with you, so that you've had the dialogue with the permittees, with the county, with the local sheriff, all the people that may get impacted by that prescribed fire, as well as with your own internal folks that you're working with. So again, that's something that I could really get off on and talk a long time. So I'm not going to do that to you because that wouldn't be fair. Let's just say though that again, they can be very beneficial if we do them right and we do them in the conditions that they should be managed under. And I think you can flip that from a prescribed fire to drought is kind of the same way. You have to understand the resource. You have to understand what those conditions have been, and it's not a one and done kind of thing. You don't just push a button and because you see you're in a drought and you make a change. That's something that you should be conditioned to all along. You should be watching and making the changes as you go to get there. So I'll stop there.
Well said. Thank you, John. Maybe we need to convince you to write a book about some of your experiences.
Probably not.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. A lot of common themes already between some of what you and Brenda have been talking about. Dwayne, I'd like to turn it over to you to talk about some of your memorable experiences in this field.
Yeah, if I can get all the buttons pushed to get everything active. So some of my memorable experience was spent most of my range career in Kansas. And probably the most memorable experience was the long-term drought of the early 2000s. Since the 1950s, nobody had ever experienced anything similar to that. And we had done a lot of drought planning. We'd had several years of low rainfall and maybe even several short droughts, a couple of years, maybe 3 years at a time. But we'd always come out of those during the course of time that I spent there in Kansas. What happened in the early 2000s was that we had about 9 years of below average precip. And the things that we learned during that time, I don't think can be replicated in any other, and until you experience those effects, you can read about them. You can read about a drought of the 30s. You can read about the drought of the 50s. You can read about range management through all of the books. And until you experience those, it's hard to quantify what actually goes on. So some of the things that we learned is that no year is ever the same, that it takes more than an average precip year to recover from a long-term drought, that it doesn't just reset the button, but that you don't have to wait for the precip to catch back up either, and how resilient the range is at recovering if it was healthy going into the drought initially. So what John had to say is spot on, and I would agree with that completely. Some of the other part of that question were those considerations following. So following drought, our post-drought or even post-fire, post-disturbance, if you want to think about it, concerns are the watershed protection, plant community recovery, and invasive species. So those three probably top our list as far as the Forest Service goes when we start looking at post-fire or post-drought issues. And I'll stop there and we can move on to other folks on the panel if you'd like.
Thank you, Dwayne. Appreciate your perspective on drought in this as well. Justin, I'd like for you to visit with us a little bit about your memorable, I'm going to say experiences, because I know you've had a few. And if you could talk to that for a moment and let us know, what was that experience like? And what was your most memorable experience?
Sure. Thanks, Jessica. So, over the past 5 years on our ranches, we've experienced 3 major fires: the Ryan Fire, Beaver Creek Fire, and the recent Mullen Fire. Altogether, there were about 250,000 acres that burnt both upwind and downwind of the ranches. The first of those fires burnt from June through until December, and then the others were shorter period fires, though certainly the Mullen Fire, which got to be 190,000 acres or so, was a significant event for us. When I think about just the memorable experiences around that, being on the ground in those fires, in the path of the fire, or watching it go away from you, it's obviously a terrifying experience that I think many of us can imagine. The image that comes to mind, or images come to mind, on the recent Mullen Fire, we were out in the middle of the night. It was 11 o'clock at night or so, catching horses out in the fields because we needed to get them out of the way of where the fire could easily grow. And you're out there without flashlights because you don't want to scare the horses. And in our case, you had 100 or so horses out there, and you can feel the warmth of the flames on your face. And, it feels very real. And, at another fire where we were gathering cattle out of the forest that was upwind of us, and you've got cowboys out cutting fences to allow those cattle to drift out of the trees and before the flames. And while that's happening, you have, embers falling on your hat while you stand in the fields in your haystacks that you've just finished putting up. It's a challenging experience. And, I think about juxtaposing that with then later on, say in that evening, walking through the campsite of these firefighters that are there. They're local, state, and federal different groups that are helping to respond to that event. And, they're bedded down for the night. Some of them have had maybe scary experiences of the day, or just a work a day sort of firefighting experience, and you feel some gratitude, and not a small dose of it. And, it really comes down to that sense of community that I think that Brenda alluded to. And then also, Dwayne and John sort of talked about planning and response. And, as I think about, our own experiences with these fires, and whether it's affecting our guest or our cattle operation, it really comes down to who are the people that you've developed those relationships with, your neighbors, your agency partners, whether they're just city or town or county, federal, state. Those really are the things you have to set in place beforehand, so that when the emergency comes, and it will come someday, that you've got those relationships and you know who to call. And so I think that's one of the key lessons learned for us, but also I think an important thing to keep in mind, because those, you have all of these really terrific feelings as a group as you respond to an emergency. So then how do you carry the challenge then becomes, how do you carry the connections that you make throughout the event, whether you've made before, on through your response? Because if we've learned anything in these 3 fires, the fire itself is the 100-meter dash, and then you immediately have to go into a marathon. Now, in our case, we have 3 marathons going on at once. And so you have to manage how you go through that. And the only way you do that is through collaboration, partnership, and pre-planning.
Thank you, Justin. That's, what a memorable experience you have. And I just think that the experiences that you all just talked about are all, although vastly different, there are some common threads. And I want to touch on one of those maybe for a few minutes. Justin and Dwayne both spoke a little bit about considerations in your roles as a land manager, whether as a ranch manager or within a federal land management agency. Your considerations for post-fire recovery or drought management and drought planning are really important. John and Brenda, can you speak to the timelines and decisions that you considered as you faced these types of events? Justin and Dwayne have spoken a little bit about it. Could you follow up on that line of thinking a little bit? We can start with you, Brenda.
Okay, sure. Well, I think Justin hit it. I could feel my heart start beating faster, thinking about exactly what he's talking about when you're in the middle of trying to, move cattle or catch horses, the fire is burning, and then you've got family and neighbors around too, that are facing the same things. So everyone, and I think on timelines, I don't think it could have been said any better than what Justin did. Is you are in the 100-yard dash in the midst of the fire, and for us it lasted several days, and that dash, the course changed every day. You had to change. So we are very, very lucky in our county and in our state, and especially in our area in Reynolds Creek where I live. We've got good neighbors, we've got good county commissioners, we've got good people. We had good Rangeland Fire Protection Association. So all of that stuff with timeline was fast. But then it gets into the fact that you've got a lot of people in a small area that are looking to move cattle, ship cattle. That's also happening fast, because it's not like a grocery store where you can put them on the shelf. You've got to figure out how to deal with things. The agency is not only dealing with that, but the agency in our area is dealing with wild horse issues. And yes, they very much are also working with us on our livestock, where we can go, fences we've had to cut, animals maybe in places where they're not permitted to be, but we're all aware of that. But they've also got the public looking at things like the wild horse management areas and such. So all of that's moving fast. And then you put on the agency aspects of, you've got about, and John, you may have to correct me here, which would a couple of weeks to get your post-fire recovery plan together. And as a rancher, a permittee, again, that's where it comes down to. You need to know your ranch. You need to know what's going on with your BLM stuff. You need to know the community level, what's going on there, and be able to interact with these agencies within a 2-week plan so that it's meaningful. There's a couple of things too that have to be on the forefront. And one of them that we have in our resource management plan is 2-year growing season rest. And that was a conversation that has to come up in the post-fire recovery, because it's not just, we'll rest now and then we get to go out next year if everything's good. We have to have those discussions immediately and talk about that in the planning process. And again, those relationships, we were able to get some things in there like a fuels management, a targeted grazing component conversation, because we had been talking about things earlier on. But it's pretty frightening how quick you have to move on that. And so it's important for the community to know. Our county commissioners are very involved in that, our neighbors, and as a rancher to know how quickly things have to move, and know what's out there and what you need to be doing.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with Brenda. It moves awful fast. We do have just a short time frame to put together a plan, and I think it really comes down to for us to be successful, whether it's the agency or whether it's the permittee, the community at large. We need to have those relationships up front. We need to understand the roles and responsibilities, who's doing what. I think it's important from the agency side to understand the needs and the concerns that the permittees have. It's important to understand for the permittees to understand the needs and the concerns of the agency. You know, while we're talking about initially up front, we've got all the concerns of the permittees, but then we're also fighting a fire, you know, so we've got that going on as well. Post-fire it gets tough because we have a short turnaround on when we get our plans in, and it's important for us to get the plans in so that we can get funded to take the kind of actions we need to do that initial stabilization work, to deal with the erosion concerns and all those initial things that we've got to deal with. We've got to get some fences put back up, you know, all sorts of things that have to happen. And so we've got a short time frame to do that. We've got to have the relationships up front so you can bring all the people together. It's probably the hardest thing that we have going on is the communication component of that, because if you're on the fire side, you're worried about putting the fire out. If you're on permittee side, you're taking care of your livestock. And then we've got the people that got to try and put everything back together after the fact. And so they're focused on what they're doing. And in reality, we need all those groups together sitting at the table so that we can talk about all the issues and make sure we hit all the points that we need to hit. And so the relationship component of it is the hardest part, the most important part. Add in mankind's inability to communicate, and you know, you're just hitting a wall real fast. But again, as Brenda said, here in Idaho, we're lucky because we have good relationships. We have a lot of pre-work done just from the mental side of it. You know, we think about what those needs are. What are the permittee needs? What are the agency needs? What help do we get from our other partners, the state and any NGOs that may want to step up? There's just lots of things going on, lots of people to help. It's tough. I think it's the easiest way to say it. It's just tough.
Yeah, lots of coordination for sure. And I love how you stress repeatedly, the panelists have stressed the importance of relationships before you face drought, before you face unplanned fire, and really as you prepare for prescribed fire as well. Dwayne, do you have anything to add from a forest perspective to what John and Brenda have discussed related to timing and considerations?
You're on mute.
So it's hard on everybody. It's hard on permittees for sure. It's hard on agencies. We've got people pulled in and you know, they're fighting fire for weeks at a time, and that pulls them off of their job. So they've got their job to catch up on when they go back. Plus all the folks that are at the forest or in the district where the fire occurs. And then you've got the reports like Brenda and John described, is that there's a fast turnaround for us to get those reports in, try to evaluate and assess what all has been damaged or affected by the fire, and then try to put a plan together. For us, it's hard we want the permittees, first of all, to be successful. They are our partners in managing the landscape. And that is first and foremost. Those relationships that we build with those permittees are long-term and should be long-term, and we value those. With that said, sometimes it's hard to fully stock the forest or the district and yet have the flexibility to absorb those displacement head months after an allotment's burn. So this year, as an example, on the Mullen fire, we lost somewhere 760, 780 head months over the course of that fire up there. We've worked with other forests and districts in our region, and we've probably got 550 to 600 of those head months at least available for people to go to in other districts or other forests. So that flexibility it's there, we're working on it, but it's not the easiest thing for anybody to build into a system where you're trying to keep as many permittees on allotments and to make sure that the landscape is managed properly.
Justin, I know you faced, you know, since Dwayne has talked about the Mullen fire and you have as well, I know you faced some interesting timing considerations yourself. Can you expand on some of those considerations especially, you know, between now and the present time and the time that the fire was out, which really wasn't that long ago. How have you handled the timing considerations, and how have you had to adapt?
So actually, each of these fires has burnt both forest and BLM, Forest Service land and BLM. So the two agencies handle things post-fire recovery in a different way and have different timelines. And that's something that is I think important for landowners to understand ahead of time, because they're managing towards different needs and have different regulations that they have set up. In terms of timing, you know, in some places you're able to have a relationship with your range con. They know the land, they know you as a land manager, and they can help you understand when you're going to be able to get back on. But it really depends, and that's one of the things that I find is hardest as a land manager, private land manager, is knowing what that timeline. John mentioned how fast the turnaround has to be, and it is quick, but it's also that quickness has to be quick because it's starting the next clock, which starts the next clock to help you finally get to the end result of maybe in a couple of years you're going to have something back. So it's really important for people to know that fire recovery you're not going to be on that same place in a couple of years. And as I was reflecting just on some of the conversation that you all had there a second ago, thinking about trust and, you know, that those early relationships and relationship building is critical before, during, and after the fire. And part of trust is knowing each other. It's also something that has to be continually rebuilt. I don't remember if it was Dwayne or John that talked about, you know, these people that are on that fire. They have to go back to their regular lives. You know, one of the district chiefs for the Mullen fire, he'd come out of DC, and that is not his normal routine. But there were so many fires that, you know, he came and he did a yeoman's job of dealing with what he was dealt, right? But then everybody has to go back to their workaday plan. And so in terms of timing, you have to realize that you're going to have to build relationships and build them again. And then you're going to have to build them again because those different people are going to turn over. And so in order to set yourself up for success for that, you have to be calling people, but you also have to document as much as you possibly can so that you can help to make sure that everybody has the right information going forward. So in terms of timing, that's one of the things that I think has been a surprise for me is learning that turnover timing and how that really fits in, because it really comes down to, you know, we're all in it together. We're all trying to make the best landscape possible, but it really comes down to self-advocacy and what do we need to do to be sure that we're advocating for ourselves to be heard, and how do we make sure that we're hearing what other partners or needs are so that we can fit into that network and that collaborative approach.
Well said. Do any of the panelists have follow-up to that? Several of you talked about opportunities or barriers for adaptive and flexible management post-fire, through drought, really in any land management considerations. I'm wondering if we could maybe spend a few minutes talking about some of the opportunities that you all think exist, or where you think you've seen some barriers before and how you work together to overcome any obstacles to adaptive or flexible management. And Justin, I might just start with you since you're not on mute right now.
Okay, that'll remind me to mute myself next time. In terms of barriers, I mean, I talked about that documentation and turnover. I think that really definitely plays into it. Barriers to recovery. You've got to be sure that if you haven't been planning your landscape usage well, and you're operating at a really max capacity, which, let's face it, is in agriculture, we're living and working on the edge of economic viability every day. And so there is these opposing needs to maximize your stocking where you can, but you have to do it really cautiously and not get yourself to 100% stocking, because then if you get into the drought that was faced in Nebraska, actually in Wyoming too, 2000s, where you've got this 9-year period of extremely dry weather and you were stocked to 100%, you're going to really struggle. And so that's hard. And you can move your livestock to another place. You can change the way you run your operation. But to do that, you have to relearn a landscape, because the partnership that exists in terms of managing the landscape, that exists because the people that are on the ground, some of the people that are on the ground are the landowners, or the leaseholders. And so they know that landscape that they work in. And to then go learn another can be challenging for anybody to do. So those are just a few of the barriers. I don't want to be redundant in the other things that I've mentioned earlier.
Yeah, thank you. All the panelists were nodding their heads as you spoke. John, do you have any follow-up to that from a federal land manager perspective? What do the opportunities look like and the barriers to manage adaptively and flexibly, in a flexible manner? Sorry.
So I think I want to go to something that Brenda had mentioned earlier, and that is, she spoke specifically to the plan that we have in Owyhee County that they had to face when they dealt with the soda fire, and that is that the emergency stabilization plan focused on a 2-year recovery window before they could turn livestock back out. And I'm going to go there because that's just one example, because it's a big example in the sense that one of the bureaucratic things that we've got to get past is we've got to start letting the land talk to us. And that's how we should be planning, is let the land talk to us. So if we put calendar dates or we put specific numbers, it's not going to work. We're going to run into a wall at some point. It may work for 5 years, 10 years, whatever, but at some point we're going to run into a wall. And so as we develop our plans for the long term, we need to be really focused on the needs of the land, and each incident is going to be different. So we've got to be flexible and adapt to what the needs are then. For instance, I mean, if we write an ESR plan and we say that this is the magic seed mix that we're going to put down on the lands. Then we go to buy seed and we can't get the magic seed. So then we've got to turn to something else, but we can't, because the plan said you've got to have this. So right there, you're dead in the water, because you don't have the time to make a change. You don't have the flexibility in the bureaucratic system to make a change. So we've got to be really thoughtful up front about how we set ourselves up for failure or success. And I'll let that, I'll leave it at that, because I think that for me is the big one, is we have to be really thoughtful about how we plan on the front end. Our planning has to include everybody when we do it. It can't just be done in a vacuum. If we do it in a vacuum, we're going to end up, with something that's not going to work. So I'll pass it on to somebody else that has a lot more wisdom than me.
Well said. Dwayne, do you have any follow-up on that? And particularly, I'd like to hear some of your kind of practical experiences in managing drought on federal lands. And are there ways that, managers, regardless of if you're federal or private, what are some practical considerations for managing for adaptability and flexibility through a drought situation? Yeah,
so again, drought is one of those, when a fire happens, it's instantaneous, or virtually instantaneous. It's very quick relative to a drought that can be, everybody is hoping that next week it'll rain, next month it'll rain. And so it's a long, drawn out, prolonged process that can be very mentally challenging from an endurance standpoint. So from that aspect, we very much would like to be adaptive in our management from numbers and timing. I think that John made a very good point. I think that we need to be more flexible and listen to the land and what the land needs. It is really, really hard to get that very last bite of grass and hit that magic 50% or 40% or 60% degree of use this year in every pasture on every allotment. And it just doesn't work exceptionally well. I'm also not a very big fan of the consistent moderate grazing. I think that there's a value in understanding recovery and understanding what that terminology actually means to the land, to the soil, to the plant community. I think that there's a natural or a normal variability in plant percentages within a community that's still healthy. It doesn't have to be a magic window, but I think that we need to be cognizant of what each site is capable of producing, where that plant community is now, and what goods and services do we want that landscape to provide, and then manage toward a plant community that provides resistance, resilience, and also delivers those goods and services that we expect out of that landscape. So given all of those targets and all of those goals, I think that we do need to be more flexible and adaptive in our management, and yet understand that there are, that grazing is a tool and we should be using that tool appropriately. Timing, intensity, duration, and frequency are all aspects. And if we're not talking about those 4 fundamentals of grazing, then we're really doing grazing as a tool a disservice. So there's lots and lots of things to understand about plant community management, from diversity to soil health and hydrology and all of those different things. But if we can get on the same page where we can, as permittees, as land managers, as people who are interested in what's going on the landscape, and actually be able to share those visions, and so that we're communicating the same thing, I think that we can reach a lot more collaboration and a lot more flexibility moving forward with our management.
Thanks, Dwayne. You mentioned a couple terms. I'm going to pivot to Brenda for this next kind of line of questioning or way of thinking. You mentioned a couple terms there that I think are often discussed when we consider fire, drought, and really just land health management in general. The idea of creating resistant and resilient communities. It's certainly a hot topic after any extreme fire or drought occurrences. So Brenda, can you talk a little bit about how you consider proactive management on the landscapes that you work in and within your operation?
And I think this is a great segue, because both John and Dwayne talked about, when you hit those limitations or those barriers because something's written on paper and you go out onto the ground and what's on paper isn't anything that's happening on the ground, whether it's, a seed mix may look really good from research papers you've read or from what your hypothesis is or you think, but when you actually go out and are working that on the ground, I think it's really important to note that everything's not going to work. And in answer to your questions, for resilience and resistance, managing our personal ground, we have to be adaptable for that. And whether it's drought or whether, say, we wanted to have a planned fire, and on our private land and work through something. As a private landowner, we've got the flexibility to adjust, whether it's for weather, whether it's for what the soil conditions are. We have made over the years on one of our allotments, when we first were utilizing it, it was cow-calf pairs. It just was not functioning like we would like to see it. So we made it was an economic decision too, because in our business, when you change from cow calf and end up keeping your yearlings over to have a management potential, there's a little paycheck lapse there for some of those. And so, but it was a business decision, and we were able to utilize that field differently because on a year where cow calf could go in there and utilize it well, then we could do that. If we needed to alternate or put yearlings in there because they graze and they move and they function differently, utilize water differently, we had that flexibility. And it has paid off in the long run on the permit renewal because we were able to turn that field around. So I think for resilience, John hit it. What limits us more than anything, and we had the flexibility because we had a little bit of date flexibility built into our permit. Not a lot, but we were able to analyze that and figure out what we could do working forward. When we renew our permit, again, we're going to look for some, we're going to have conversations early on, and we're going to look for some opportunities there from with our monitoring data, with some of the things that have come through with the fire restoration and the resilience we see. We want to look for some of that flexibility. But in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to get to is what Dwayne and John were saying is you can do that on your private ground, maybe even a little bit more on state land leases here in Idaho. But in order to truly be able to have that resilience, and we need to be able to have a little bit more of that trust built and that flexibility in the permit process. And actually, the agency is working towards that. So I commend that, but those are the conversations we're having, and the benefits have been some of our, I call them the detractors, that have looked at maybe litigation again at what's worked on paper and thinking that the litigation aspect is going to change that resource. We have taken those detractors out on field trips, and there's been some uncomfortable moments, but we've had some really in-depth conversations about looking at the ground, looking what that has done. And I feel that we're slowly being able to make a difference by having the diversity on those field trips, but having the people and the agencies that work that land to be able to see the damage that can be done by having just this is the date on, this is the date off, and it may not, Mother Nature, God doesn't work that way. So it doesn't always work that way every year. So being able to have that flexibility and the adaptability, and again, it's a trust factor, is going to make us able to hit that resilience and be able to make that across land management. We'll have the unfragmented landscape. We can be able to do that on state land, on federal land, public land, and then on our private lands when we get to that point. And I think that we're making good conversation towards that, to get that flexibility and realizing you have to be able to look at it for the year that it is and manage for that in order for it to be resilient.
Yeah, that's great, Brenda. I'm hearing, several common themes continue, and this trust building and relationship building is key. Justin, can you add on to the idea of proactive management and how you think about building resistance and resilience into your operations and the land itself?
Sure, thanks. And first, I want to say I couldn't agree more about the flexibility in terms of really looking at the resource on the ground, not having our dates dictate the issue, right? And so I really agree with that line of thinking. When I think about ranching and land management, I really think about it in terms of diversity. So it's about your diversity of forage available. It's about your diversity and flexibility of the business you are in. So a healthy mix of breeder and feeder cattle in our case is something that helps to be able to change and adapt as necessary. In our case, we also have a guest ranch that is able to add to that mix. But I view it when you look at landscapes as they burn. You know, I personally take exception to the term of catastrophic wildfire because you know, fire does a lot of really positive things. It's painful. I mean, God knows we've had 5 painful years, you know, at our place, and yet at the end of it, what you end up with is a landscape that is mosaic. And you know, when you look at diversity of a healthy landscape or diversity of an economy, it's about what are the different pieces that allow you to be able to flex and change, and allows that grassland to be flexible, or your business mix to be flexible. So when I think about resilience, I really think about it from that perspective, and then that gets to pre-planning. And how do we make sure that we don't have all of our eggs in one basket? And we're looking at how we can diversify the way that we can stock, do our business, and then also as we look at our recovery efforts, how can we diversify the partners that we're working with, so that because some of those partnerships will bear fruit, and some might get mired for a longer period of time, and so you need to work all of those partnerships you know, together, and that can be one of the challenges you know, that we all face, is how you really manage that on an ongoing basis. But I think it's really important, that mosaic approach to all of it.
Thank you, Justin, for that. I'm going to give John and Dwayne a minute to respond to that question, and then we'll move on to our audience questions. We have a lot of really great questions coming in. So keep the questions coming. John, Dwayne, do you have any thoughts related to this question? Anything you want to share before we move on?
I don't.
Okay. Go ahead, John.
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is I really like the conversation about mosaic, and I think as we look at how we use that word, it fits with some of the other common themes that we talk about. I mean, I was going to talk about, you know, it's important that we're doing active management, because we've got to work on ensuring that we have a healthy vegetative community, and we have to use all the tools. But in reality, all the tools aren't just mechanical or prescribed fire or livestock, you know, targeted grazing, but all the tools are all the social components that go into that as well, and you know, and all the economic considerations that we gotta put on the table. And so I really like to describe it like that, as a mosaic, because to me that's really what we're looking at. It's not a one size fit all. It's not a black and white scenario. Although after fire sometimes it's pretty black, and you know, but really it's all that stuff together. And so that's why it's important that we have the relationships. And again, I'm going to harp on the relationships even a little more. I mean, we talked about trust, but it's really having a shared value system. It's not just trust, it's having respect for one another. I know it doesn't seem like it, but Brenda and I do have some sort of a respect, you know, back and forth. Honesty. We need to be honest when we're talking about things. We need to be able to understand the needs that each of us bring to the table, because they're all different. And if I don't understand what Dwayne's needs are, how in heaven's name can we come to some sort of common understanding and agreement and make some forward progress? You know, and so as we talk about all the importance of active management, we talk about all this understanding the need of the resource. We better understand the need of the people, and we better understand the importance of the relationships, because that's where it starts and that's where it ends. So I'll quit. I get on my box.
Yeah.
That's great. Go ahead, Brenda.
Jessica, I would be remiss if I didn't jump in and just harass John a little bit back. But I think John makes a really good point. Is trust is one thing, but relationships are another. And I think I alluded to it earlier. Is it doesn't mean that we agree on everything, because we have some really good discussions back and forth. But I think the key that he hit was the shared values and the respect for maybe limitations that John might be facing he may totally gut what we're saying from a permittee's perspective, but I have to remember that John Ruhs is the Idaho State BLM director too, and and has some boundaries there. But we have some really good conversations and good discussions. And like I said, I think it's really important that, it doesn't have to be all that. Yeah, although I know John loves sunshine, flowers, and unicorns, but sometimes it's good to have those really controversial discussions with respect and with the shared values, so that you can come out to the best doable, the can do, so that you don't have to say can't. You can find the can do's with that. So with that, I just want to say that I think that's really important. Is it doesn't mean it's always agreement. It means respect, shared values, and building a relationship.
Yeah.
I've got to add on to that, if you don't mind, Jessica, because I think there is so much value in approaching a relationship with the assumption that you are coming together to work together, not as adversaries. And that is something that sometimes is lost as you're developing new relationships, and you have fear. You might have fear going into a relationship. This landowner may not be good at managing cattle. This agency director may not understand my needs as a cattle manager. And so you have these things that are real fears going into interactions. And it's super important to sort of take that air out of the room a little bit and come to it with the approach that you're going to work together to understand each other's perspectives. When you do that, what I have found with every agency person I've worked with, every other landowner I've worked with, is that when you come to it that approach, that finding the shared needs, shared goals, you come out with better results. So it's definitely a piece of, I think, critical advice that you've talked about there, Brenda, that really is important. You got to have that trust. You got to be able to have the hard conversations, and you have to assume that you're going to be able to work together, because then you can. It might be hard, but you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's move to some questions. I continue to appreciate the common theme of building trust, building relationships, and being proactive in that work as well, not just in your management. We have a question from Bree Owens, and we'll start there. In relation to post-fire recovery and grazing, what steps can be taken ahead of a disturbance event to address agency-mandated rest periods of 2 to 3 years that may not be beneficial to context-specific landscape recovery, where brush encroachment or maybe invasive species such as cheatgrass are a concern? And Bree goes on to say, current standards seem arbitrary and out of date with current landscape conditions and latest emerging science based on information on soil, range, and forest management. Who would like to start? Brenda, it looks like you have some thoughts.
So
my thought was that John Ruhs should answer this question. So I think she's got some valid points, and I think we did talk about it, but I think John has some comments on it.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say that, and I can't speak for the Department of Ag, but for the Department of Interior, we have a national seed strategy that tells us that we have flexibility in rest of post-fire rest. The problem is that that's a national standard, and we have a lot of old and outdated plans that precede that, and we haven't been able to get all those plans updated and refreshed. And so we do have pockets, quite a few pockets actually, where we have those old plans that have that mandatory rest period in them. And so that's something that Department of Interior needs to be working on a much quicker pace. And I think we are in a lot of places, but that's a standard that it's really not there. We've allowed it to continue to be there on that small scale, but nationally we've recognized that doesn't work for us. Again, we've got a lot of big things going on nationally with outcome-based grazing and targeted grazing and a lot of those kinds of things. Just we call it oftentimes outcome-based land management, and that's really where we need to be. And so we're seeing that shift. We just aren't completely there yet.
Mhm.
Again, but that's where we have those conversations up front. We work together early on to develop relationships, and we have the ability to springboard from those relationships into dealing with the emergency at hand.
If I may add on to that, I think you're right, John. And I think there are pockets where those resource management plans or land use plans have been revised or amended over time, and certainly in consideration of that flexibility, but those processes do take time. Brenda, go ahead.
Yeah, Jessica, I guess I would just jump in because John and I have had this conversation, and I've had it with, a number of people, and in our county, our commissioners are aware of it, all of our permittees are aware of it. But our land use plans, when they're outdated like that, and we have had some extreme successes with the soda fire recovery with the grass, but and different things. But when there's some, I don't want to call them poison pills, but the extreme barriers that are cemented within your land use management plan, the unfortunate part is the agency's hands are tied, because then we all get tied up in a lawsuit because they're in there. So one of the things that would be really beneficial, as you alluded to, Jessica, is being able to go in and make those, get again a diverse group of people that agree that this is not how the land management is working, and advocate for those changes, and have it a simpler, I don't know if this is my pipe dream for, on my bucket list, I guess, is to have a simpler way to go in and amend a land use management plan with something in it like that is actually detrimental to managing the land. It may have sounded good at the time it was written, and I'm sure there was a lot of argument for why it was in there, but we're seeing, some of those things, it needs to be addressed on a site-specific basis rather than a blanket size in a land use management plan.
Well said. Dwayne, do you have anything to add, or did we cover it well?
Well, and I can only speak for the Forest Service and Region 2 of the Forest Service, but we don't have a blanket policy for how the length of time that we're not going to restock those allotments. It's an allotment by allotment basis. Part of that depends on where it was beforehand, what kind of plant communities, what kind of fire actually occurred out there, whether it was a backfire, a head fire, a flank fire. All of those things happened in those pastures. And then what the recovery time, what is the climate, what are the climatic events, the timing, frequency, duration of rainfall following that following year. So it's a case by case, evaluation by evaluation, and it takes a lot of time, but I think that it's legit to be out there to see what's going on.
Thank you. Justin, I'm going to pivot to you for the next question. It's from Emily Knox. How might we better strike the balance between being prepared for crisis states like fire and drought without over planning and painting ourselves into a box? Are the methods we are currently using inherently too rigid to address these dynamic landscapes and dynamic processes?
I think that's a good question. I think it really connects to the last one in many ways. I think about, in terms of preparing and not creating a box that you then have to operate in, I think about analyzing your strengths and weaknesses. What's your strength as an operation? And where are your weaknesses? What's your strength of your landscape, your grazing, and where are its weaknesses? And when you look at it from that perspective, then it helps you to identify which particular avenues you should pursue in preparing for an event or following up from the event, because some of those are going to have outsized impacts based compared to others. The reason I think it connects with the last question also is, there is an increasing ability because of improved mapping and GIS abilities and that being built into our system to be able to look at a landscape question with in a much more complex and diverse way than we could before. And where you have these blanket statements that are in land use plans, those are done, and some of those are old and were done in a time when that complexity, you couldn't manage all that complexity. Now, that's easy to say. Yeah, we can now look at it with much more depth, but it also is a challenge that can give you analysis paralysis. So from my own perspective, it gets to strengths and weaknesses, then how can you use your data to help guide the decisions that you're going to make? And how can the business do that? And how can the land agency do that to help them accelerate to the best time for that particular area to be allowed to be used after fire? And I want to add just one other thing, because we've really focused a lot on fire because it's an acute problem. We all face it, and it hurts, right? And you know when it ends and when it started. Drought is not that. And so when we look at preparing for drought, that's something that really I think needs to be addressed early, because if you don't address it early on, then that drought will sneak up on you and it'll get you. And so finding your strengths and weaknesses around drought is really as important as that fire piece.
Thank you, Justin. Other thoughts from panelists on that question? Oh, let me read it one more time. How might we better strike the balance between being prepared for crisis states like fire and drought without over-planning and painting ourselves into a box? Are the methods we are currently using inherently too rigid to address these dynamic landscapes and processes? Go ahead, Dwayne.
Sometimes they seem to be, and we're going to face I think that we're going to face those challenges with some of the fires that occurred in Colorado this year, is that to be adaptive and use targeted grazing for some of our broadleaf plants as a control mechanism would be my preference before using a herbicide on those same acres. The secondary invasion of an annual grass and an annual invasive grass, to me, is a bigger threat and a bigger challenge. But we're going to have to get our work done this winter to be able to use targeted grazing or adaptive management to address those broadleaf, if we do in fact get broadleaf invasive species in some of those fires.
Thanks, Dwayne. Brenda?
Well, I think there's I'll be interested to follow what Dwayne's talking about too, because as we talked about earlier, we have a targeted grazing pilot project, I guess, for lack of a better term. It's really working well over here with partners along the Owyhee front for fuel load reduction. In addition to that, we're looking at some, again, where you get the best bang for your buck, just like you would on your private ground. If there is in our area some cheatgrass fields that need to be utilized differently, we need to have those conversations and maybe talk about, targeted grazing, expanding or fuel load reduction, because it does protect the uplands too for the wildlife, for your other pastures that are in the uplands and the sage-grouse habitat that we are in. So I think those conversations are there. One question I would have for you, Dwayne, when you're talking about targeted grazing, because this came up early on, we are focusing on using targeted grazing and helping have the conversations. And I guess excuse me, part of my role as the Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership Coordinator is to help facilitate conversations and maybe get permittees to think a little bit outside the box, because one of the things that's critical is targeted grazing occurs in somebody's pasture allotment in their area. So sometimes you have to encourage that thinking for how they can participate in it, because oftentimes, you know, in our area, we don't have to worry about sheep or goats moving through, because we don't have that sheep or goats grazing because of the bighorn aspect. So there's potential in areas to use different types of livestock, but also I would be curious to know how you're having the conversation to encourage those permittees to think about how they can be part of that conversation, where it may take some adaptability and a change in the thought process.
Well, and that's exactly the kinds in class, right? We're talking about different kinds of livestock. In this case, you would be with cow-calf and yearling cattle as two different or different classes. So kinds would be sheep and goats and cattle, and then classes would be, you've got two different classes of cattle that you could use. But when we're talking about annual plants, we're talking about a timing issue and being very quick to react. And those conversations, we're back to the relationships and the conversations and the trust and the planning on the front side and the anticipation of those plant communities occurring, and then the permittees being allowed to access and take advantage of those in a very short time window. So in the case of cheat in our part of the world, we would, you know, maybe it would be best to send a large group of animals in and kind of get that depending on the number of acres and the location, and get that crop grazed off, and then bring those animals back out and let the perennial vegetation have a chance to recover. Or in the case of smooth brome, we might choose to trickle a few animals in that can go around and select and find all of those green leaves when they're available, as opposed to one herd. And it's still targeted. We're still targeting a particular plant, and we're still targeting and have a prescription of what we want to occur out there, results. But it's two different ways of using the critters to sculpt the landscape and sculpt that plant community.
Great conversation. Any other thoughts from panelists on that? Go ahead, John. If you have something.
Yeah, I guess, you know, a lot of times where I find myself going is if we manage together up front, we allow ourselves the flexibility and the ability to deal with whether it's fire or drought. In the, you know, the after effects of those are much less because we've been doing the work up front. And all the things that we're talking about are things that we should be focusing on, we should be working on as partners on the land up front. And I think that's how we change that fire cycle dynamic. That's how we change the you know, the quick short fuse on drought. You know, we're waiting till the last minute to make a decision on, well, we can't turn out because drought's bad. You know, if we're working together all the time, we're dealing with all those things all the time. And I think that's the dynamic we need to change. And part of it's the bureaucratic process, part of it is the litigation process, but a lot of it is because we as agencies and the users, the managers who actually use the ground, we haven't been running in sync, and we need to get back to where we're running in sync and we're having the conversations all the time, that we're partnered up all the time. It needs to be the way of life versus, you know, the forced action. I'll quit.
Yeah. Well said. Common themes continue on. We have a question here from Tim Kirkpatrick. Is anyone using native seed bank practices for ongoing grazing improvement and as a seed bank in storage rotation for disaster recovery? That you know of, Justin?
Sounds great.
It does sound good. Maybe I should preface that with, does anyone have experience with that or know of those types of programs?
So I would say that there are places where we have forage reserves or grass banks that we've been able to develop. I think they're few and far between. I think it really requires permittees working with the agencies to agree on how those things are going to function. It's not something that you can just quickly set up. It's something that has to be well thought out, and really it comes back to there are some legal components of that as well, because there's some Taylor Grazing Act requirements that you have to take care of, and a number of things like that. And so again, it has to be a community driven developed forage reserve or grass bank.
Yeah, so we use, we call those reserve allotments in a lot of cases where, but you're exactly right, John, the community itself has to support that. We use those in a lot of different cases because they're a smaller allotment, they're maybe not well watered allotment. There's a lot of variability or reasons why those don't necessarily get term permits. I don't know that they would be a seed bank, but a grass bank. That's the way that we use them. So we want them to be used 2 or 3 years out of 5, let's say. That would be the goal, so that they're available when some sort of disturbance or disaster occurs. The problem that we had this year, and a lot of times that we have, is that the number of displaced permittees and head months overwhelms what's already buffered into the system. And so while we have a couple of those available, we don't have enough of those available. And they're not always available in and around the locations where the fire occurred. So they're not exceptionally convenient in a lot of cases, but they're there and they do take up some of the slack, but they're usually not adequate.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more question. And I'd like to, we have a lot of really good questions, just so you all are aware. Panelists, thank you. Your experiences and your expertise in this area have shown for sure. And the audience is very active with a lot of questions, but I think we'll go to this question. And we'll start with maybe Brenda or Justin. Do you conduct monitoring on your allotments? And what are the panelists as a whole, what are your thoughts on the best approaches to monitoring, specifically for both condition and trend in relation to the comments about grazing, timing, intensity, duration, and rest, and mosaic conditions across the landscapes? Justin or Brenda? Brenda, I think you're ready. I'll let you go ahead.
So this is a great question. And one of the things, as a rancher and one who's concerned about overall landscape and as a private landowner and also a permittee, we monitor every day we're out there. And there's something that we're, and I have to admit, my husband and I, we had to get this through our heads too, because we know this. We are monitoring every single day that we're out there. Whether it's winter, you're still looking at conditions because that's water for us for irrigation in the spring. The summertime, as Justin was saying, you need to be prepared. Think about how your land behaves during drier seasons, because it may not be a drought, but you may have a drier season. So all of that is is monitoring somewhat more on an internal level, but we do it on our, if you live in town, you are monitoring your lawn or your garden based on water needs, on unwanted plants. You know, it may not be cheatgrass or Medusa head, but it could be, you know, other things. So I think there's a really good conversation there. Then you get into the question of formal monitoring, because agencies, data programs, even if you are looking to incorporate, say, an NRCS or equip, work on a project with BLM, monitoring is something that you need that data, the tangible data. So we monitor, we take notes on our private ground and on some of our grazing association ground. But as far as our BLM ground, we are in a cooperative monitoring agreement that Idaho has put in place with the State Department of Ag. It's a photo monitoring aspect, so we monitor in that capacity, but we also do some of our own monitoring, and we also go out with our BLM RangeCon when they go out, so that we are having the same conversation, knowing the same language, knowing, you know, we know where our your yard's not perfect. It may look perfect when you drive by, but every pasture's got an area too, and you need to be willing to have those conversations about, hey, this may not have any potential for getting better, or this may have potential for getting better, and going out and monitoring and having those conversations, even utilization. So long answer to a short question. Yes, we do monitor, and a lot of it is, you know, done to know our ground too, and be able to monitor on a daily basis. But also we need to be able to help our agencies support decisions that we want to move forward. And especially as they were looking for TNR, or maybe for increasing some AUMs, because the potential is there. You cannot do that if you don't have the data to back it up.
Yeah. Thanks, Brenda. And TNR is a temporary non-renewable permit. Justin, do you have anything to add to that conversation about monitoring? I'll give you about.
I guess I'll add that you know, monitoring is important. It's challenging. It's challenging to do it in a scientific way. And you know, if you have a permit, it's going to have it might have riparian zones, sage zones, and trees all in one, and they're going to be spread across a landscape that you can't be out monitoring every day. And so, for me, this gets to the importance of long-term relationships and management, and because once you get an understanding of a landscape, you can see how, if one area is responding well, you can see, you know, that in general other areas may need to be may be doing well, or others may need to be checked. Now, to the extent that you can increase the science of it, it's helpful and useful in terms of your planning. So I guess that's one aspect of the monitoring of it. I'd say, and then I would just add that you know, agencies and private landowners and leaseholders are heavily incentivized to manage their land well, because you want to be able to use it the next year. And so I think that's important to acknowledge when you look at the people that are out there managing a landscape. That incentive exists for them.
Yeah. Thank you, Justin. Well, we are about out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I first want to thank the audience for your engagement, for all of the questions. I'm sorry we did not get to them all, but we've got a record of all of them, so we'll certainly consider them for future programming. I also really want to take a moment to thank the panelists here today. I'm grateful to each of you for spending the time, for sharing your thoughts and your experiences and your expertise in this area. Really appreciate it. And I think that this really is the start of a conversation about land management, whole land management across boundaries, thinking about it in terms of the mosaic that Justin talked about, and in terms certainly of building relationships and being prepared for the changes that might be occurring. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to all. Registrants will receive a link to the recording of the webinar today, so be looking for that email from the Western Landowners Alliance. And thank you all for your time and attention. Happy holidays. Take care.